All right, welcome back. So last time we saw an argument for how, even though human life is generally, or on the whole, meaningless, it's possible for us to still live meaningful lives. We can do this, recall, by directing our lives towards goals of our own creation and choice, which are genuinely noble, beautiful, otherwise lastingly worthwhile and attained. We'll talk more about this kind of thing today in our discussion of Susan Wolf's The Meaning of Lives. We'll also get what is, I think, a pretty interesting and compelling argument that we ought to pursue meaningful lives. So, not just that we can have meaningful lives, but that we ought to sort of make it our aim to have meaningful lives. So, the Wolf piece starts off by making an important and to this point overlooked clarification about a couple of different questions. Remember, philosophy, we're trying to clarify and all this sort of thing. So, we have this question, what is the meaning of life? And another question, is there any meaning to life? So the first question, what's the meaning of life, says Wolf, is a question about whether there's any point or purpose to life. In philosophy talk, to ask whether there's any point to something is to ask about its telos, or telos. That's like sort of what it's for. So the telos of a car is to get one from point A to point B. The telos of these lectures is for you to get clear on various topics in philosophy. So to ask whether there's any meaning of life, or what's the meaning of life, is to ask sort of what's the point? What's the aim of life? And the answer to that question, says Wolf, sort of depends upon whether God exists or there's some sort of intelligent designer or creator. Presumably, if there is such a being, then life probably does have some kind of point, some kind of end aim. But if there's not, then it's less clear that there is. But the second question, whether there's a point to life, right? Whether there's any point to living, we can try to answer, and we can answer this question without having to answer whether life has any point to it. So the point of life versus the point to life, right? There's these different kinds of questions. You might say the point of life is to, glorify God, supposing such a being exists. Whereas you might say the point to life is to live a meaningful life. And those things can come apart, is the idea in the paper. So let's think about like meaning in life rather than meaning of life. So at first glance, according to Wolf, meaning in life has something to do with engaging things that are subjectively rewarding or fulfilling, right? That's kind of like, we saw the same thing in the Taylor. That's like our first intuition, just like, well, it's doing stuff that you value, that makes you happy or content or whatever. And Wolf wants to say, as with Taylor, that this is just the wrong place to look, right? We can imagine someone whose life is subjectively fulfilling. That's fulfilling to them, or rewarding to them, which we would still classify as meaningless. So just much like the Taylor, Wolf reckons that the best place to start, by getting a sort of feel about what a meaningful life might be, is to look at some lives we would definitely classify as meaningless. And she gives a few examples, which I think are quite good. So the first example she gives, excuse me, I'm just getting over a little something, so apologies. My voice sounds weird. So she gives a few nice examples. Example number one is the Blob, right? So this is a person who just like sits around all day or night, just drinking beer, watching trashy TV shows. He or she accomplishes nothing, has no connection to anyone or anything, so on and so forth. They just kind of hang out, drink beer, eat Cheetos, watch TV. We can imagine that such a person could be perfectly content, right? Perfectly fulfilled, living a subjectively sort of enjoyable life. But still, from the outside, we would say things like, that person's wasting their life. Gosh, they just don't do anything. They're living a meaningless life. These seems like a clear case of something that's meaningless, right? The Blob does. So that's example number one. Example number two, the useless. Now, these are people who just sort of flit about, right? They just sort of flit about pursuing idle, decadent, and silly pleasures. My mind goes instantly to things we see on shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where it's like they just sort of, they get the new Louboutins and the new Yves Saint Laurent scarf and the new Coach handbag, and maybe they give a couple bucks to charity here and there, or maybe they do a little bit of outreach work. But at the end of the day, they're just doing. They contribute nothing. So these are the useless on Wolf's view. And again, like we might say, like, yeah, that looks fun for a minute, right? But there's a sense in which they're wasting their lives. There's a sense in which their lives are meaningless. And then finally, Wolf gives us a final example of the bankrupt, right? So these are people who've devoted their life to some putatively meaningful project only to find out that at the end of the day, it was all for nothing. So imagine a scientist who's worked on something for his or her whole career, only for the research to be undermined by some new discovery or some paradigm shift or something like that. Now, it's not so clear that we would say this is a meaningless life. Or at least it's not the same kind of meaninglessness that we see in the first couple of cases. But I think Wolf's point here is that, like, well, it would certainly feel to the person whose work was undermined that they'd wasted their lives, that their life had been made meaningless. And we would have to work really hard to say some person was our friend or mentor. It would take some real doing, right, to convince them that, like, no, like, this is not the end. Like, your life isn't meaningless. Like, you should go on, right? So it'd be a little bit of work. So we have these kind of three things, right? We have the blobs, right? So people who have no connections, they don't do anything, they just kind of hang out and, like, they're sort of fat and happy, the pigs in slop kind of an idea. Just not really doing much, but they're low level pleasures kind of deal. Then there's the people who sort of like I said, flit about, from thing to thing, not really contributing anything, not really engaging in any meaningful work. And then there's the people who seem to have been engaged in meaningful work, whose work turns out to have not been so meaningful after all. So these are sort of good examples, Wolf thinks, and I think I agree, of people whose lives are meaningless. And this, she thinks, and I'm again inclined to agree, gets us towards a picture of a life that might be meaningful. We can get some idea of what a meaningful life might consist in. So it's a life that is actively and at least somewhat successfully engaged in a project or projects of positive value. Now, this is a good first pass, says Wolf, but we need to clarify a bit about what we mean. So by projects, we don't just mean like determinate tasks with clear end goals, right? We can mean project sort of much more broadly construed. A relationship can be a project on this picture, and she talks about this in the piece. So moving on, by active engagement, we don't just mean that the person is doing the thing to the best of their ability and taking it seriously, right? It's not just, you could be doing something to the best of your ability and taking it seriously and still like not be actively engaged. So like your heart has to be in it, right? It has to be something that you identify yourself with, something in which you take pride, right? And by positive value, we of course don't just mean something that's subjectively valuable to the person, right? Because the blob might say that their TV watching and beer drinking is of positive value to them. So we don't mean that. We want to track what like most people would say has positive value. So ask 100 people, and if most of them are like, yeah, that's positive, then that's the kind of positive value we're on about. Now, of course, there's loads of questions here about what if we had values that were very different and so on and so forth. I think those are all good questions. Those are all good places to push, but we're not going to push on those now. We're just going to sort of keep on and like make sure we're clear about what the paper says. Okay, so given that like we're a bit clearer now on what a meaningful life consists in, it's one that actively engages in projects that are in some sense objectively good and in some sense are successfully engaged. So objective, again, versus subjective goodness, like it might be subjectively good for me to do such and such, but that might not be objectively good insofar as it wouldn't be good for people beyond me. Excuse me. So we mustn't here equate objective goodness with moral goodness, says Wolf. Moral goodness, at least in some respect, is concerned with like benefiting or honoring humanity as a whole. But surely you could lead a meaningful life without doing this. Like we might think that someone like Caravaggio, the painter, for example, wasn't like a particularly moral guy, right? But he was still leading a meaningful life. Pick anybody who, we hear a lot about separating the art from the artist kind of deal. Find anyone who's making like sort of beautiful art and then look at them as a person and you'll be like, ooh, not a great person, but meaningful life. So we can, those two things can come apart is the idea. And we also, conversely, right? So while it could be true that someone is leading a meaningful but not moral life, we might think that someone can live a moral life that's not meaningful. So morally speaking, right? We might say like the Blob is doing just fine, or at the very least, like he or she is not like in the red, as it were. But we still say their life is meaningless. So it seems like moral good and sort of objective good come apart here. In a way that is important. So we've got a really clear picture now of what a meaningful life is. We know also that people want to lead meaningful lives, right? I mean, we totally do. No one's like, my life's meaningless, woohoo! Like, that's not how we are. We're not stoked about it. Remember the threat and the challenge, right, from the Taylor paper. The challenge to live a meaningful life and the threat of learning too late that we've failed to do so. Right? This is a very real motivating thing. So it's clear that we want to lead meaningful lives. So from here, Wolf goes on to ask whether or not we should want to lead meaningful lives. Like, is it good for us to want to live a meaningful life? So clearly, at the first place, it's not bad for us, right? Like, it's not bad that we want to live meaningful lives. So at the very least, it's permissible for us to want to and strive to lead meaningful lives. But as Wolf points out, we seem to want to say something stronger. We don't want to just say that it's permissible to pursue meaning. We want to say that it's obligatory that people pursue meaning, and that people who fail to do so are making some kind of mistake. Not that it's bad for the world, mind you, right? We're not saying they're making a moral mistake, but they're doing something that's bad for them, right? They're doing something that, all things being equal, is not great for them. It's like when we see a friend, getting hooked on drugs or, in a relationship that is not great, right? We say like, well, it's not like bad for the world, but it's bad for them. They shouldn't be doing that. They're making a mistake. And again, like we feel this way about our friends and acquaintances who seem only to pursue shallow and vapid things. And again, I think we worry that one day we'll wake up to find that we too have led a meaningless life, as in sort of these bankruptcy kind of cases. So, if our intuitions are right, and people who fail to pursue meaningful lives are making a mistake, then we should be able to say what it is that they're doing wrong, right? If you're making a mistake, well, what did I do? We're like, well, I couldn't say. That's not great. We want to be able to say, if we're going to accuse them of making a mistake, we better be able to say what it is they're doing, right? So on Wolf's view, failing to pursue a meaningful life is a mistake because doing so fails to comport with facts about the universe and our place in it. So the argument goes something like this. So we all tacitly accept that some things are better than others. That's pretty true. Humans are better than rocks. A piece of fine art is better than scraps of paper in a compost heap, and so on and so forth. So we have sort of a ranking on things. Some things are better than others. And this suggests that we all sort of tacitly accept that there's more to the world than mere subjectivity, that there's something objective. Put another way, we tacitly accept, and tacitly here just means like we just, we don't really think about it, we just sort of accept it, that the world is full of non-subjective value. Like, for example, if you met someone who was just like, no, rocks are better than people, you'd be like, I don't think so. That sounds wrong to me. And most people would say the same thing. So there's some idea that like, no, like there's something we can all sort of glom onto, right? There's something more than just like, I think these things are better than those things. Like, no, we all kind of think that certain things are better than some other things. So when we take a step back in the way that like sort of Nagel and Taylor have talked about, this subspecies aeternitatis kind of perspective of the universe thing, we're forced to acknowledge that we are but tiny specks in a vast universe. But given what we just said, we're tiny specks in a universe that's filled with value. Objective value, things that are sort of genuinely good, that are of positive value. They're out there, along with us. So now, says Wolf, consider someone who's leading a meaningless life. The blob, the useless, the bankrupt. And suppose that they're quite content and happy with that life. They've got no interest in pursuing anything meaningful, that is to say, they've got no interest in pursuing projects of positive value, or objectively positive value. On Wolf's view, such a person is acting as if what matters to them is all that matters, period. They're acting as if they are the center of the universe and the source of all of the value therein. But it's just false that any one of us is the center of the universe or the ultimate source of value therein. So to persist in living as if one is the center of value is either very silly or very solipsistic. And solipsism, if you don't know, is the, dare I say, pathological view on which you believe you're the only one that exists in the universe. So you don't want to be silly, right? No one wants to be silly, at least not like as a matter of logic. And I think no one should want to be solipsistic because I think it's a pathology. So the only way to harmonize with these facts about the universe, right, that the universe is vast and filled with value, and we are just tiny specks therein. The only way to sort of jibe with those facts is to pursue a meaningful life. That is to engage actively and somewhat successfully in a project or projects of positive value. To do that is to say, like, yes, I'm a speck in a vast ocean of meaning, and I'm going to do what I can to sort of add meaning to this, to add value to this thing that we're all doing, because I recognize that there are things outside of me that are of value, and the pursuit of them is good. To fail to do that is to just think probably a bit too highly of yourself, right? Like, think about Nagel and the absurd again. You know, we take ourselves very seriously, but all the reasons we have for taking ourselves seriously are sort of unjustifiable and open to doubt. This is to sort of just take yourself seriously and never wonder. And it seems like, again, like you're making some kind of a mistake. So we want to harmonize the universe and our place in it, according to Wolff. And the way to do that is to pursue meaning. So we should want to harmonize ourselves with the universe. Like, we shouldn't want to make this kind of solipsistic or silly mistake. And the only way to do that is to pursue a meaningful life. So that's the view. And notice that it doesn't depend at all upon whether God or some intelligent being exists. Life can be absurd. Life can be pointless. But it needn't be. And we ought to do our best to ensure that it isn't meaningless. We can find meaning in life, regardless of whether there's any meaning to life. And I think, given that, pardon me, a lot of philosophy sort of takes on this sort of methodological naturalism position, which is to say it proceeds as though there's no supernatural or no God or anything like that. We want to kind of answer questions without having to appeal to some sort of divine authority. So we should like to be able to say that life can be meaningful, even if there's no sort of supreme being or giant intelligence or whatever. And Wolff, she thinks, and I'm not sure what I think, I'm inclined to agree, at least to a point, is that she's giving us a way to say, like, no, there's meaning to life. There's a meaning to life. There's meaning in life. Whether there's any meaning to life, who the hell knows? But there's meaning in life. So we don't need anything to get us meaning. We can get that all on our own. And maybe that's good enough. So that's the paper. We should probably talk a bit about this movie before we get out of here. I don't want to run too long, so we'll just go through it quickly. So just to say, like, this is one of my favorite movies probably in the last 10 years. And it's also the first movie I saw when the theaters opened up after the pandemic. So it's, pretty... I remember I was taking a nap and I woke up and I was like, I'm going to go to the movies. And I saw there was a movie with Nicolas Cage playing called Pig. And I was like, well, this seems weird and I love Nick Cage, so let's go see it. And it was man, what a great film. So I hope you all enjoyed it. So I think as as you reflect on the movie, I think it's worth asking whether and to what extent the characters in the film are leading meaningful lives by the standards we've discussed over the last couple of lectures. So we can think about Darius, that's Amir's father. We can think about Amir and and Derek. Derek is the chef at Eurydice. And we can think about Robin, Nick Cage's character, right? There's like sort of four, we have sort of two extremes in Darius and Robin, and then kind of Amir and Derek in the middle. I think, like, on my view, all the characters I think are trying to find meaning. That's what I'm thinking. I do think that if we remember the Taylor piece, where he says, like, you can find meaning just by looking at like a flower and thinking about something beautiful rather than thinking about the plot of land and it being something to acquire and profit from, right? One of those is meaningful, one's not. But it seems like Darius is living a pretty meaningless life, right? He's ruthless just because he sells like rare food. He's like a ruthless monster, keeping his wife alive just for selfish reasons. He's terrible to his son. He kidnaps and has a man's pig murdered because it's profitable. It seems like he's not doing great with respect to pursuing a project of positive value. On the flip side, I mean, it's worth in Darius's defense, like, he is sort of locked in by grief. We have no way of knowing what he was like before, right? That's sort of a line of the movie. Like, were you always like this, or just after she died? And he says, "Were you?" To Robin's character. So on the flip side, I think we have Robin, who, like Darius, is sort of locked in by grief. Although I think there's reason to think towards the end of the film that he's sort of need to finally process things. And I think Wolfe and Taylor both would say that Robin is living a meaningful life, even if it's somewhat dampened by his grief. Like, his life's super simple, right? He cooks, he goes truffle hunting, he presumably grows and forages for other food, but arguably he's successfully pursuing a project that's genuinely positive. I think this is debatable, but I think he at least is onto something here. I think the real sort of meat of the story, though, is with Amir and Derek, right? So we have, like, Amir, who's this, like, young, hopeful guy trying to break into his father's business, maybe show the old man that he's got what it takes, But it's obvious that his heart's just not in it, right? It seems like, he's psyching himself up in the mirror, like, I'm going to sell these scallops or whatever. And then he goes and he's, like, very reserved and like, hey, could you help me get, like, a table? And it seems like he's doing all this for the wrong kinds of reasons, right? He wants the new Camaro, he wants the Gucci belt and the fancy shirt, and he wants to be able to get a table at the hottest restaurants at the last minute. Like, he wants to be seen as a real cultured kind of hotshot, which I think explains, like, his, like, classical music primer tapes that he's listening to. Those very snooty tapes he's listening to. It seems like what he's trying to find a meaningful life, but he's looking in, like, the wrong places. And I think the same thing is true of Derek, the chef at Eurydice. Like, he's convinced himself that he's doing something meaningful because the critics and the customers and the financials all say that he is. But he's not. His heart isn't in it. Robin knows it, and he knows it. And I think that's probably the best scene in the movie. The scene when they're at the dinner at Eurydice. And I think an interesting thing, like, I think very few things happen on accident in pictures like this. So I don't know if you know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice from Greek mythology. It's a couple. Eurydice dies and goes to Hades, and Orpheus has to go to Hades to rescue Eurydice. And Hades is like, you can get her, you can go in and get her on the condition that as you're leaving, you don't look back. And Orpheus looks back, and he sort of breaks the deal, and then Eurydice is trapped. So there's something about this idea, I think, using Eurydice here is trying to show you that, like, Derek is kind of in some way trapped in hell, but it's a hell of his own making. Because, again, he's sort of convinced himself that, the critics and the customers and the financials are all that matter. But I think Robin shows him, I think we see in his interaction with Robin that, like, he knows that's false, right? He knows that he's making a mistake. So regarding both Amir and Derek, I think there's something to be said here about living an authentic life. And authenticity hasn't really been mentioned in particular in any of the papers we've read about the meaning of life, living a meaningful life. But it seems like Woolf kind of gets this in with like your heart has to be in it, right? It has to be genuinely you, right? Something with which you identify, something in which you take pride. And so it seems like authentic, you know. Like think about Thelonious in Hamlet, right? To thine own self be true, kind of deal. Authenticity seems to be for Woolf, and I think just in general, a prerequisite. Excuse me, to living a meaningful life. Now, I think that's debatable, and you might argue that I've got it wrong here, but I think there's something there. So, okay, that's going to do it for our discussion of Pig and Susan Wolf's The Meaning of Lives. I think both rock, and I hope you enjoyed them. I look forward to seeing your comments on the discussion boards, and I'll try to pop in and weigh in as much as I can. You might have noticed my backgrounds have been changing. I'm sort of traveling for the holidays here, so um, anyways, I hope you all had a nice break. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying the course up to this point. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next video.